Did you know that in 1944, the U.S. Navy commissioned its first black officers, but only after cutting their training time in half, hoping they'd fail? And when all 16 men passed with the highest grades in Navy history, the Navy refused to believe it and forced them to retake every exam? But here's the part that will make your blood boil. Even after they passed again, with an even higher score, the Navy still only commissioned 13 of them. 3 men who passed were sent back to the enlisted ranks with no explanation. This is the story of the Golden 13, and it's about to shatter everything you thought you knew about American military history. Let's set the scene. It's January 1944. World War II is raging across the Pacific and Europe. The United States Navy has nearly 100,000 black sailors serving in its enlisted ranks. But not a single one is an officer. Not one. For 146 years, since the Navy's founding in 1798, no black man had ever worn the gold stripes of a commissioned officer. And it wasn't an accident. It was policy. From 1893 onwards, black Americans could only join the Navy's messman and steward branches. That meant cooking, cleaning, serving white officers their meals, shining their shoes, washing their dishes. These were the only jobs available to black sailors, jobs that ensured they would never rise through the ranks, never command, never lead. And from 1919 to 1932, the Navy didn't even allow black men to enlist at all. Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels, under President Woodrow Wilson, simply banned them completely. For 13 years, if you were black, the Navy's message was clear: we don't want you. By 1932, black sailors made up just 0.55% of the entire enlisted force, 0.55%. Even when black men were finally allowed back in during World War II, they were still restricted to menial labor. The Navy refused to train black men as electricians, quartermasters, gunners, or machinists. White officials genuinely believed, or at least claimed to believe, that black men lacked the intelligence, discipline, and character to be officers. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox was one of the loudest opponents. He openly opposed letting black and white sailors train together or serve in integrated units. In his view, the Navy should remain exactly as it was: white officers commanding white sailors, with black men confined to kitchens and laundry rooms. But pressure was building. Civil rights leaders like Philip Randolph and Walter White were hammering the Roosevelt administration. The black press, newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender, were relentlessly exposing the hypocrisy of fighting fascism abroad while enforcing Jim Crow at home. And then there was Eleanor Roosevelt. The First Lady became a persistent advocate for change, meeting with civil rights leaders and pushing her husband and Navy officials to act. In June 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8802, prohibiting racial discrimination in federal agencies and defense contractors. In April 1942, under mounting pressure, the Navy finally allowed black men into general service ratings for the first time. But allowing black enlisted men was one thing. Making them officers? That was a bridge too far for Navy leadership. Until politics forced their hand. In 1943, Adlai Stevenson, a special assistant to Secretary Knox and future two-time Democratic presidential nominee, sent a memo recommending the Navy commission a dozen or so black officers to ease the political heat. Notice the language: a dozen or so. Not because the Navy wanted to, not because it was the right thing to do, but because it was politically necessary. And so, in January 1944, 16 black enlisted men received orders that would change their lives and American history forever. The selection process was shrouded in secrecy. To this day, official documentation is scarce, but what we know is this: the Navy handpicked 16 men who had already proven themselves as leaders. These weren't random recruits. Most had college degrees, some had advanced degrees, many were athletes. All had exemplary service records. They were teachers, lawyers, union organizers, college students. They were the children and grandchildren of slaves who had clawed their way to education and achievement despite a system designed to crush them. Here are some of their names you should remember. Jesse Arbor, a Pullman porter and doorman from Chicago. Samuel Barnes, who graduated from Oberlin College in 1939 and would later become the first black person to serve on the NCAA Executive Committee. Dalton Baugh, who would go on to teach at MIT. Reginald Goodwin, a successful attorney. Dennis Nelson, who had a master's degree and whose father and grandfather had both served in the Navy, one in the Civil War, the other in World War I. Nelson was known for his pride, his intelligence, and his refusal to shrink. He owned a 1940 Mercury convertible that he washed every single day, even in freezing weather. His classmates called him Dennis the Menace. Graham Martin, John Reagan, Frank Sublette, George Cooper, William White, who would later become a presiding judge in Cook County, Illinois. And then there were three more. Augustus Alves, a merchant mariner, J.B. Pinckney, a labor organizer from Atlanta, and Lewis Mummy Williams, who had attended the University of Chicago and worked as a union organizer for railroad workers. All 16 were summoned to Camp Robert Smalls at the Great Lakes Naval Training Station in Illinois. Most of them had no idea why. When they arrived, they learned the truth. They were going to become the Navy's first black officers. But there was a catch. The normal officer training program was 16 weeks. The Navy cut theirs to 8. Think about that. White officer candidates got 16 weeks to master seamanship, naval regulations, gunnery, navigation, and military law. The Navy gave these 16 black men half that time. Paul Stilwell, a naval historian who later interviewed the survivors, put it bluntly. The white officers thought it was their mission to fail the candidates. Even Lieutenant Paul Richmond, the Naval Academy graduate who designed their curriculum, admitted years later that he made the course brutally difficult. He claimed he wanted to create a better seagoing naval service. But some of the men saw it differently. To them, Richmond was condescending. To them, the message was clear. You're not supposed to succeed. And just to make sure, the Navy expected a 25% failure rate, the same attrition rate as white officer candidates. If the numbers held, at least 4 of the 16 would wash out. The Navy was setting them up to fail, but the 16 men saw through the plan, and they made a decision that would define their legacy. Samuel Barnes later recalled their pact. We decided not to compete with other members of the group, so we had many study sessions together. We were determined to succeed in spite of the burdens that would be placed on us. We knew that we were the foot in the door for many other black sailors, and we were determined not to be the ones who were responsible for having the foot removed. Read that again. They knew the stakes. If they failed, the Navy would use it as proof that black men weren't capable. The door would slam shut, not just for them, but for every black sailor who came after. So they decided all 16 would sink or swim together. Their barracks, Barracks 202, became both home and classroom. 16 cots, 16-foot lockers, 1 table set for 16. They were segregated from white officer candidates and from other black enlisted men. Isolated, watched, studied like specimens in a lab. The training was relentless. Seamanship, naval regulations, gunnery, navigation, military law, aircraft recognition. 8 weeks to master what white candidates studied for 16. But every night after the 10:30 p.m. lights out call, the men continued. They covered the barrack windows with bed sheets to block the light. They huddled in the bathroom, the head in Navy parlance, and studied by flashlight until their eyes burned and their heads pounded. They quizzed each other, drilled each other, pushed each other. If one man struggled with a concept, the others wouldn't rest until he understood it. If someone was falling behind, they pulled him forward, because they had made a promise. If one of us makes it, we all make it. And then came exam day. The results stunned everyone. All 16 men passed. Not just passed, they scored higher than any all-white officer class in Great Lakes history. But instead of celebration, the men faced humiliation. High-ranking white Navy officials refused to believe that a class of black men could outperform white candidates. It had to be a mistake. It had to be cheating. It had to be something. So the Navy did something unprecedented. They forced all 16 men to retake every single exam. Imagine that. You've just completed the most grueling 8 weeks of your life. You've studied until you collapsed. You've sacrificed sleep, health, and sanity. And you passed with flying colors. And your reward is being told you have to prove yourself all over again because white men don't believe you earned it. But the Golden 13 didn't break. They retook every exam, and they scored even higher. Their final class average was 3.89 out of 4.0. To this day, it remains the highest grade point average of any officer class in the history of the Great Lakes Naval Training Station. The Navy could no longer deny the truth. These men had not only succeeded, they had excelled beyond any reasonable doubt. But even then, the Navy refused to let them win completely. In March 1944, all 16 men stood ready for commissioning. All 16 had passed. All 16 had earned the right to wear the gold stripes. But the Navy had one final act of sabotage. Without warning, without explanation, the Navy announced it would only commission 13 men. 12 would become ensigns. The 13th, Charles Bird Lear, would become a warrant officer, a lower rank than the others. 3 men, Augustus Alves, J.B. Pinckney, and Lewis Mummy Williams, were told they would not receive commissions. They had passed every test. They had met every standard. But they were being sent back to the enlisted ranks anyway. No official reason was ever given. But historians believe they know why. The Navy wanted to bring the success rate down to 75%, the same as white candidates. If all 16 had been commissioned, the pass rate would have been 100%, proving beyond doubt that black men could outperform white men when given the chance. The Navy couldn't allow that narrative, so 3 men who had sacrificed everything, who had studied until their fingers bled, who had passed every exam with honors, watched as their classmates were commissioned while they were left behind. One by one, the others were called up. Jesse Arbor, Samuel Barnes, Philip Barnes, Dalton Ball, George Cooper, Reginald Goodwin, James Hare, Graham Martin, Dennis Nelson, John Reagan, Frank Sublett, William White, and finally, Charles Lear as warrant officer. The 3 who weren't chosen sat in silence, waiting to see if their names would be called. They never were. It was a deliberate cruelty, a final reminder that even when black men succeeded, white institutions would find a way to diminish that success. And so, on March 17, 1944, the Golden 13 were born. But there was no fanfare, no graduation ceremony, no public celebration. The Navy kept it quiet, hoping to avoid publicity that might encourage more black men to apply. The 13 men put on their uniforms, wore their gold stripes, and became officers in the United States Navy. And the fight was far from over. You'd think that earning their commissions would bring respect. It didn't. Despite being officers, the Golden 13 were still banned from the Officers Club at Great Lakes. White officers refused to share social spaces with them. When Samuel Barnes entered an officers' club in Okinawa, Japan, months after being commissioned, nearly every white officer in the room stood up and walked out. They would rather leave than sit in the same room as a black officer. White sailors routinely refused to salute them, a basic military courtesy required when encountering a superior officer. Graham Martin recalled one incident where a white sailor walked right past him without saluting. Martin stopped the sailor and asked why. The sailor didn't answer. So Martin took off his hat, held it in front of the sailor, and said, "Now, salute the insignia of the United States Navy." The white sailor saluted, but then he said something that revealed the depth of the hatred these men faced. "But you do understand," the sailor said, "that I'm not saluting you." In Newport News, Virginia, a passerby approached George Cooper, his wife, and their daughter on the street and shouted, "You black son of a bitch! I read about you guys, but I never thought I'd meet one." This was their reality. They wore the uniform. They held the rank. But white America refused to recognize their authority, and the Navy ensured they would never command in combat. Navy policy explicitly barred black officers from commanding white sailors in battle. So despite their training, despite their qualifications, the Golden 13 were given menial assignments, training black recruits, overseeing all black logistics units, commanding small harbor tugs. John Reagan was given make-work jobs, running drills, giving lectures on venereal disease, patrolling California waters in a converted yacht. Samuel Barnes was sent to command an all-black stevedore unit that unloaded ships in the Pacific, the kind of manual labor assignment that was beneath his training and abilities. None of them saw combat. None of them were allowed to lead in the way they'd been trained to lead. One of the Navy instructors admitted the truth years later. After the course ended, he approached the men and said, "I just want you to know that I tried to make the course difficult so that you would not be successful." He said it out loud. The cruelty was intentional. But despite all of this, despite the humiliation, the disrespect, the racism that followed them everywhere, the Golden 13 persisted. They did their jobs with excellence. They refused to give the Navy any excuse to say they had failed, because they understood something profound. This wasn't just about them. Every black sailor who came after them would be judged by how they performed. When the war ended, most of the Golden 13 left the Navy. Who could blame them? They had proven themselves in a system that despised them. They had endured years of indignity and insult, and the civilian world offered opportunities the Navy never would. Samuel Barnes became the athletic director at Howard University and the first black person ever to serve on the NCAA Executive Committee. Dalton Baugh taught at the Navy Engineering School and later at MIT. Reginald Goodwin became a successful attorney. William Sylvester White became a presiding judge of the Cook County Juvenile Court and later a justice of the Illinois Appellate Court. In an interview with historian Paul Stilwell, Justice White said something profound. "Prejudice is not a logical thing." He was right. Nothing about what these men endured made sense. They had proven their excellence beyond any doubt. And still, the system fought them every step of the way. Only one man made the Navy his career, Dennis Nelson. He stayed for 20 years, eventually retiring as a lieutenant commander. In 1948, he wrote a master's thesis titled "The Integration of the Negro into the U.S. Navy," which was later published as a book in 1951. In it, Nelson argued that racial stereotypes were fictional and should be replaced by equal treatment and good leadership. When Nelson applied to transfer to the regular Navy, a superior asked him, "On what basis do you think we should accept your application?" Nelson's response was perfect. He said, "I'm just going to reverse the question. What reason would you have for denying it?" That was Dennis Nelson, confident, defiant, unwilling to bow. Frank Sublette later said his time in the Navy was the highlight of his entire life, not because it was easy, but because he had been part of something historic. For decades, the 13 men had no group identity. They were known simply as those black naval officers. They went their separate ways, lived their lives, and watched as the Navy slowly, painfully slowly, began to change. It wasn't until 1977 that Dennis Nelson tracked down the surviving members and organized a reunion in Monterey, California. That's where Captain Edward Secrest from the Navy Recruiting Command coined the term that would define them forever: the Golden 13. In 1948, President Harry S. Truman officially desegregated the U.S. military. The Golden 13 had paved the way. In 1949, Wesley A. Brown became the first black graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy. In 1971, Samuel L. Gravely, Jr. became the first black admiral in U.S. Navy history. In 1987, the U.S. Navy dedicated Building 1405 at the Great Lakes Naval Training Station in honor of the Golden 13. Today, it's the first building new recruits see when they arrive for basic training. In 2006, a memorial was dedicated in North Chicago, Illinois, honoring the Golden 13 and Doris Miller, another black naval hero. The last surviving member of the Golden 13, Frank Sublette, died in 2006. All 13 are now gone, but their legacy lives on. They were set up to fail. The Navy cut their training in half, gave them hostile instructors, segregated them from support, and expected them to wash out. Instead, they achieved the highest grades in naval history. The Navy forced them to retake their exams, humiliated them, and denied 3 of them commissions despite passing. Instead, they opened the door for thousands of black sailors who followed. The Navy refused them respect, refused them combat assignments, and made their service a living hell. Instead, they became judges, professors, athletic directors, and heroes. The Golden 13 didn't just integrate the Navy. They proved that excellence cannot be denied, even when the entire system is designed to crush it. So the next time someone tells you that systemic racism is a myth, that people just need to work harder, that merit is all that matters, tell them about the Golden 13. Tell them about 16 men who did everything right and still had the system rig the game against them. Tell them about 3 men who passed every test and were still denied their commissions. Tell them about officers who were refused salutes, banned from clubs, and told to their faces that white men would never respect them. And then tell them this: despite all of it, they won. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Drop a comment below about which part of this story hit you hardest. And if you're hearing about the Golden 13 for the first time, share this video. Their story deserves to be told. Subscribe and turn on notifications because we're bringing you more untold black history every single week. Stories that were buried, heroes who were erased, truths that demand to be heard. The Golden 13 fought a war on 2 fronts, one against fascism abroad and one against racism at home, and they won both. We'll see you in the next one.